Stacy, you've been a trailblazer when it comes to researching sex differences in male and female physiology and how that translate into sport participation and physical activity. And I think what you've done really well is taking that research and conveying it not only to elite athletes, but also to the general population. You've written your best-selling
Thanks.
books, podcasts. I feel like you're on every podcast now, and I'm so honored to have you here. And if I may say so, you've certainly become a role model for myself, and I can imagine many other women who feel like they've been left out of the conversation for a long time. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a group effort for all of us to change the conversation. So
Yeah.
I'm just glad that we can be global and start, really speaking and pushing. So thank you.
I, I love that. Yeah. And I've heard your TED Talk where you talk about your university experiences as being this big turning point for you in terms of getting involved in this research and also from a practice side of things as an athlete yourself, having this realization of, in your words, women are not just small men. And I'd love to start, actually, if we can, by going back a little bit in time to your childhood and growing up, because I think what you've done requires a lot of courage. And so I'm curious, how do you evolve into this woman who is ready to roll up her sleeves and be part of that conversation?
Well, if you were to ask my mom, she'd sit back and laugh and go, "Never in a million years would I think Stacy would be doing what she's doing." Because I grew up and I was like the most quiet, shy kid ever.
Really?
I had an older sister who kind of protected me. And we were a tight military family. So
Mhm.
we would kind of rely on each other, but we'd be moving from different place to place. And you just kind of have to get stuck in and make friends and understand the environment. Otherwise, you're kind of going to get lost. And I think one of the turning points when I was growing up is when we landed in San Francisco. My sister ended up going to university, so it was just me in a
Mhm.
new environment in inner city and being a minority in my high school and finding a voice, like talking to other people, understanding
Mhm.
where they're coming from, understanding my background, and realizing that all of our lived experiences are different, but we all have the same motivation. So being able to talk to people we were all in the same class, we'd have conversations running cross country together, and just really being able to share those experiences kind of gave me the opportunity to talk and understand
Mhm.
that, hey, what I'm experiencing, what I've done is completely different from my friend Jennifer, whose parents immigrated from China. So our
Mhm.
backgrounds are different, but we can talk about it, and then we can push for the same message within our class. Because, in San Francisco, they try to make us wear uniforms, and none of us wanted to, so we all banded together to protest, to be like, look, when you put girls in skirts instead of, like wearing pants, it reduces the ability to feel free and play and chat and all those kinds of things. So,
Mhm.
that, I think that was part of the big turning point where I no longer was uh the kid sister, but I was
Mhm.
actually my own person.
Hmm. And so it sounds like you really started to observe just individual differences across the board, not necessarily gender differences.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
It was the cultural aspects of it. And I still find that, matter of fact, I was just finishing writing a piece about the socio constructs and how a lot of people are siloed. And if you don't understand where someone comes from, then
Hmm.
how are you going to effectively coach them or treat them if they're a patient, get really the best outcomes for that individual? Because
Yeah.
when someone shows up, you don't know what their experiences are. And so if they have a visceral hate to something that you're doing, you're not going to get through to them.
Hmm. Yeah, and I can imagine that these cultural constructs are something that also you, in your education, have to fight a lot with. I think we all experience differences in whether it be gender or cultural elements in one form or another. But I think it takes a lot to actually go from observing that and living that to wanting to take action. And you're now very much like the face of this topic, I think. But I'm sure it wasn't all, smooth sailing to get to this point. Can you talk about some kind of hesitations or fears or any barriers you might have faced along this journey?
Every day, still.
Cool. Whew.
I
Yeah.
say that because, I mean, growing up in that tight family, we also were never told we couldn't do anything. Like,
Hmm.
I think the one turning point was when my dad was asking me, "Oh, what do you want to do when you grow up?" Like parents do. And I go, "Oh, I want to be a secret agent or I want to be in the SEALs." And he's like, "Well, you can't." I'm like, "What do you mean I can't?" He goes, "Because they don't let women in." I was like,
Wow.
"What?" And that was like the first time where I was like, "What do you mean I can't be like
Wow.
Wonder Woman or Superwoman or something?"
Mhm.
But all the other times, like we been able to say or do what we wanted within reason, and we had a
Yeah.
rationale for it. And then when I get out in the real world, and I realize that's not how people operate, and you get
Mm.
pushback for being a woman challenging, you get
Yeah.
pushback for being a
Yeah.
female entrepreneur challenging. So every step of the way has been some kind of process and challenge. And I mean, just a couple of weeks ago when we were all in DC sitting around a round table, and there's this whole table of really smart, intelligent women, and we all admitted to each other later that none of us felt like we had a right to be at that table. So that talks
Wow.
about imposter syndrome, right? And you
Yeah.
know that if men were around the table, they wouldn't be saying that or they wouldn't admit
Yeah.
it. But it's so ingrained because we all come from that male dominated field and we're always like trying to rationalize or support or cite the reasons why we're
Yeah.
doing things.
Yeah. Always kind of defending
Yeah.
yourself why you're allowed to be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have any role models or people you could kind of reference for that?
I've had a few along the way. Like I look at my mom and her mom, my
Mhm.
grandmother, and they
Mhm.
were like my mom being a military wife had to like
Yeah.
do everything and stay within construct, but still encouraged us and was a really good role model. And then my grandmother, um, she held the house down, but also helped my grandfather when he started a company. So there are lots of
Mm.
things within there that was outside of the norm. Just really strong willed but humble women. And
Mm.
then on the outside, it's my mentors throughout academia, particularly Marcia Stefanik, who was the PI for the Women's Health Initiative. She is my
Mm.
mentor at Stanford, and she is so humble and she doesn't realize how smart she is. And
Mm.
she navigates the men's space with such grace. And so
Mm.
seeing all of the really strong women and how they fight forward, but the ways they do it. And then I have
Mm.
friends who are now in the C suite in different businesses and how they've gotten there. So it's been a collective of mentors, but I think the common thread is being passionate and humble as you go
Mm.
through and try to kind of manage the situation and manage the state that you're in.
Have you ever thought about kind of giving up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. Um, And I mean, I had that thought this morning because I was like, oh, it's just so hard being down here in New Zealand and
Yeah.
so much stuff going on. And then I know I was like, yeah, I went for a ride and thought about it. And I came back, I was like, no, because there are so many women who still don't have the opportunity to have a voice.
Yeah.
And I have a daughter who is 11 and she and her friends don't have a voice.
Wow.
And so it's always that passion and drive to have a voice when you have it so that those who don't can still, I guess, get benefit and find a voice.
Wow. Powerful, powerful stuff. I'm wondering, I mean, I can't imagine parenting, and we don't have to get too deep into this. You're obviously here to talk about things from more physiology side of things, but what kind of messages do you have for your daughter or for young people who do feel like they don't have that voice?
Yeah, I look at it like the last year of elementary school going into middle school was really
Mm.
hard for girls. And you have
Yeah.
like the mean girl situation, and a lot of girls lose their confidence.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've experienced that with my daughter, and the whole time through, I'm like, look, you just be yourself. You're very empathetic. You're very smart, and
Mhm.
you're driven, and you just keep doing you, keep doing what you do best, and you'll get support along the way, and you
Wow.
will find your feet, you'll find your friends, and 3 months later, she's like all happy because now she has friends and she has her
Wow.
voice, and so it's just really trying to stay true to yourself
Yeah.
and in the long run, and play the long game, because people who are popular when they're 11 are not popular when they're 16, and all those things. You just really have to focus on the long game and being true to what your
Yeah.
passion and belief is.
What a great message. I think there's certainly a lot of forces coming at us from all these different directions, cultural narratives. And when I listen to a lot of the podcasts that you're featured in, it sounds like you do a lot of sort of myth busting. So, for example, you do a lot of explaining why intermittent fasting may not be as effective for women, or I I hear you talking a lot about like contrary to what is in the trend at the moment.
Yeah.
How do you go from women listening to you or reading your book and actually buying into that?
That is a really hard one, because
Yeah.
whenever we post something on social media about diet, there's always some kind of attack,
Yeah.
because diet, nutrition is such an inherent part of someone's self-belief. And I'm I don't have an agenda, and I really try to have that come across as like, here is the science. This is what the science says. It's not
Mhm.
me trying to sell you a product. It's not me trying to like convince you to follow this particular diet that I've
Yeah.
created. It's none of that. It's like I'm just trying to explain what we found and what the general scientific community has found. So I'm
Mhm.
giving you the information, and hopefully you'll make a wise decision for yourself, for your body. And I think the more information we get out there and the more women begin to understand their bodies, then they start to make that transition and go, oh, okay, maybe I should try this and see how I feel.
Mm.
So I think a lot of it is about information and then self biohacking. And then that's how people
Mm.
come on board.
Hmm. Have you ever worked with someone more one on one, an athlete or whoever, who has been sort of really resistant to those changes? And how do you navigate that?
Yeah. Early days, I did a lot of individual consults and individual work. And there was a particular woman who was an athlete and a coach.
Hmm.
And she had this whole I'm training. She was training for Ironman, and she was training really hard, and she was trying to coach, and she was limiting her food intake, and she was bloated, and she was tired, but she could still get the training on the paper done.
Yeah.
I was like, look, we need you to pull back on the volume, and we need you to eat more. And because she's a coach, she's like, no, because this is what my athletes are doing. And so I was like, okay, well, how are your athletes responding to it? And she'd look, and the new ones would be responding fine, but then the ones that had been with her for a while were experiencing some of the same things as she was, like decreased performance, poor sleep, could get the training done on paper, but just wasn't being successful. So it's like, okay, well, if we're seeing that in you and we're seeing that in some of your athletes, let's try to implement one thing at a time. Let's have you fuel for
Mm.
this session. If you're going to do
Yeah.
intervals on one day, then you're only going to do one session a day, not two sessions a day. And I think it took about 6 to 8 months for her to finally come on board and be like, okay, I do need to try this. I've implemented it with some of my athletes, and I've seen their performance improve. So maybe I should try it too.
Wow, but that's a really
Very
long
long time.
time. Wow.
Yeah. Because I mean, you think about if you're a long-term athlete in a particular sport, and then you are viewed as the authority because you're also coaching,
Yeah.
it's really hard to change. Really, really hard to change.
It's funny, like when I reflect on my own experiences, I grew up with an older brother who was very athletic, and I was always just chasing him around. And then, even when I started lifting weights and going to the gym, I was one of the only women. And so I kind of created this narrative in my head where I was an exception to the rule. And a friend of mine, I was actually a rower as well. So we have that in common.
Awesome.
Um, but when I was growing in Canada, a friend of mine brought your book. This is like 10 years ago to the house. And she's like, you guys have to read this. It's all about menstrual cycle and training and this. And I didn't even, I'm so embarrassed to say it, like, I didn't even turn the cover because I didn't feel like I had that female athlete identity. And I think now when I try to convey this message about fueling to other women, I think there's also this like, oh, but that doesn't apply to me, or I'm an exception to the rule, or she looks different than I look. So it's not going to work on me. And I think that's such a challenge now. And 6 months, like, I feel nobody tries anything for 6 months. So I'm so curious, like, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to speak with you today, is because I'm like, how can I communicate this in a way that is impactful and can actually stimulate some change?
Yeah. So, I mean, we always turn it around and be like, if you exercise on purpose, you're an athlete, right?
Yeah.
So we can get that identification because who else is going to get up before work and purposely go exercise if they aren't motivated to get fitter and healthier?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's an athlete mentality right there. Even if it's only 2 times a week or 1 time a week, it's still an athlete mentality. So if you get that mentality and have people understand that yes, they are an athlete, then we have to look at how do we fuel for what we are
Hmm.
doing? How do
Hmm.
we recover? How do we have energy for our workday, for our kids, for our partner? It's like we have to look at it from that different scope, from that athletic mentality of we want energy and we want to be healthy and
Yeah.
fit. So, how do we do that? These are the ways that we can manipulate to get better energy, to get better sleep, to have
Hmm.
the reserves to deal with daily life stress. And I think being a recreational athlete is really, really difficult because you have all these other pressures of life that come in the way, and it kind of, oh well, I'm not an athlete, so that
Yeah.
doesn't apply. But we have to put that front and center that yes, you are an
Mm.
athlete.
In your experience, like, when you communicate that to women, does that kind of create change? Do you feel like, do are they able to call themselves athletes?
Yeah, when they get the idea, right? So they're like,
Wow.
"Yeah, you're right. I do. I wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning so that I can go to a boot camp or a group fitness to see my friends, but also for me. And so if I come
Mm.
home and then I'm not eating and I am rushing around and I'm highly stressed, then what's the point? Why did I get up?" So it's really empowering for them to realize that, hey, I get up to do this for me, so I better take care of myself so I can keep doing it. If
Hmm.
it's not necessarily for me from a physical standpoint, it's also me from my social standpoint. So I can be
Hmm.
with my friends and be happy and we can have these conversations. So it's really, like I said at the start, it's understanding what the drive is, what the culture is around the rationale for what people do. So then you can work that into empowerment and why they do what they do.
I think women are so notoriously good at not taking care, or people in general, maybe not just bottling it down to women, but like, when you say taking care of yourself, I feel like I even felt the resistance in myself, as you said that. And I think also just culturally now, if we dial it into cycling a little bit more, I think it's not that cool to have a lot of stuff in your pockets, and like,
Right?
and I know because I'm the opposite now. I've learned how important fueling is. So I've got as many bottles as I can take. I've got like as many snacks, or an extra baggie for snacks. But the cool ones, and I hope this doesn't like
No,
alert
because I know what you
anyone.
mean. I know
Yeah.
what you mean. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, it's like not cool to have, the jerseys are so aero and stylish, and it's like not cool to have snacks in your pocket because it shows that like you need that, right?
Yep. And then those who don't have enough fuel are the ones that are off the back towards the end of the ride. And you're like, here, you need a snack? And they're like, oh, yeah, thank you so much. And you're like,
Hmm.
yeah, okay. I admit the fact that I have extra stuff. I'm like, I'm the mom in the group, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I am a mom, but I always say that I'm the mom in the group because I have like EpiPens. One, I'm allergic to bees, but a
Wow.
lot of people that I ride with are also allergic to things. And I have extra snacks and I
Wow.
have like an Allen key and just those things
Yeah.
because I don't want to have to call someone to come pick me up, like, because then that ruins my ride. So it's like I want people to. I'll be the uncool person,
Yeah.
but at least
Yeah.
I'm going to get to the finish feeling good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something I noticed. So this year I hired a coach and started doing some really long rides consistently. And I think the biggest advice that stands out to me that he said was, think of this ride as an eating contest. And to
Yes.
me, that was like game changer crazy, because I would come home and I would actually like list calories and in my mind I was like, oh, I ate so much today, I did so good. And then you see it on paper and you divide it by 6 7 hour rides, and you're like, whoa, I'm actually under where I should be. And I feel like I ate a lot. But this
Yeah.
mentality of going in and practicing eating has been such a game changer for me. And that's why I'm so passionate for trying to advocate this further, because it's not just like lasting longer, legs feel better, but mentally you feel so much better. What do you say to the people who, and this is something I encounter a lot, obviously, just pulling in a lot of anecdotes. They say, "Oh, it's fine. I've been doing good," or "I tried eating more and then I saw I gained weight. So I think I'm fine like this. I only ride once or twice a week anyway." So
I know that's hard, especially when they are kind of fighting the whole body composition thing, right? And
yeah,
they're like, I tried eating more and I put more weight on. And that's the problem with the scale. It's like the death of food because
mm,
people see the weight on the scale, but what they don't realize, it's increased muscle tissue, it's increased muscle glycogen, it's increased plasma volume, all the things your body wants to be able to perform well. And when you're like, okay, well, you might only ride twice a week, but you want to feel good for those rides. So if you're
yeah,
joining a group ride, you can smash it and you're not off the back. You can
yeah,
attack or you can chase the bunch, right? If you don't have
yeah,
enough fuel and you haven't recovered well, then you're just going to be in this moderate to high intensity, just holding on for dear life, trying not to have a gap. And
mm,
when you start bringing it back to that and be like, it's not about weight on the scale, it's about how you're feeling on the bike. How are you feeling the days you're not on the bike? Are you sleeping well? Are you recovering well? What are your energy levels? So again, it's
mm,
bringing it all back to that daily life, like how are you feeling? And we know that carbohydrates and fuel is so critical to mitigate stress, keep your immune system up, to be able to adapt to training, to adapt to the weather, to travel, all of those things. So it's hard. It is hard.
I think something that was a bit eye-opening for me, getting more in depth in your work, is this new perspective on stress. I think culturally we think of stress as just being mental stress, and you forget that cycling or training or whatever you're doing is a stress, and then also not fueling is also a stress, and then our hormones play a different role into that as well. Can you unpack this idea of stress a little bit more, and why we should be paying attention to fueling and our cycle with that?
Yeah, so when we talk about stress, we think about eustress, which is positive stress, and
Hmm.
distress, which is your negative stress, but they both have the same effect on the body. You have a rush of cortisol and adrenaline, and part of that is to make your heart rate go up, make your breathing rate go up, start to sweat, all of those things that we see at the onset of exercise, or a sudden stop in a car, or a car door coming at you when you're on your
Hmm.
bike. All of those things are types of stress when we think about what's happening in day to day as well, right? So if you don't sleep well and then all of a sudden you're woken up by a start, or your kid comes in the middle of the night, or you have a hard day at work, all of that has those same stress responses. But we don't think about it when we're exercising because we expect sweat. We expect the
Yeah.
higher heart rate, the higher breathing rate. We expect our muscles to be sore and tired, but that is a stress and a breakdown effect on the body because your body is like, what's going on? I don't, and so you
Mm,
have your whole sympathetic nervous system that is completely wired high, and your hypothalamus can perceive that as a flight or fight. So if you're not coming to the table with fuel to counter that stress, then your brain is like, wait a second, we don't have enough fuel to counter what's going on here. So we definitely don't have enough fuel to reproduce. So we
mm,
start to see perturbations in our menstrual cycle. And if we start seeing a lengthening or shortening of the cycle, and we start having decreases in luteinizing hormone pulse, and we lose estrogen, then we lose part of our appetite control. We lose part of our ability to control blood sugar. So we start
mhm,
putting on body fat, and the hypothalamus is like, yeah, we need this. We need to bring our thyroid down. We need to increase cravings. We need to store more fat because of the stress that we didn't take care of. And we
mm,
see it in people who are highly stressed executives who aren't exercising, right? You'll see
mm,
body composition change and increase because of stress. So, stress in that exercise standpoint is so critical because we need it in order to adapt to what we're doing. But we also need to fuel the body to be able to overcome that stress so that we can adapt.
And does that apply also? Like I'm thinking in cycling, okay, yes, if I go for a super long ride, a lot of climbing, yeah, that's obviously, I know I'm under stress. But what if I just go for an hour or two after work spin?
Yeah, that is stress,
Hmm.
especially if it's after work because you've had the whole day of, mental capacity, most likely hypohydrated.
Hmm.
And if you're going after work, you might be fighting traffic. If you're lucky
Yeah.
enough to get out of traffic and not be around cars, then it's not quite as stressful, but you're still using fuel. You're
Yeah.
using blood glucose, you're depleting liver, you're depleting muscle glycogen,
Hmm.
and your body is breaking things down in order for you to just do an easy spin for an hour or two. So you do need to think about, how am I going to recover from that? And did I actually eat before I went out? When was the last time I had something to eat? Because most
Hmm.
people will have lunch and then they might have something about 3 o'clock and then they go for their after work spin at 6. And so you've had that gap. And you're a little bit dehydrated and your body's trying to find fuel. So it is a stress, even though if mentally you're like, oh, it's just a recovery
Yeah.
spin.
Yeah. Yeah, that was certainly something I had to learn as well, just going out for the hour and I'd be like, oh, just take water and that's enough. And then now that I've trained this eating, I definitely start hitting a wall, even like 30 minutes in, which is wild, but because my body is getting used to taking that fuel in, and then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
where's the energy?
And by the nature of being a woman, we
Hmm.
go through blood sugar a lot faster and we don't really tap into our liver and muscle glycogen as much as men. So we need to have that fuel available and carbohydrate availability
Yeah.
even to do your hour spin.
Yeah.
And I think that's a conversation that a lot of women are unaware of because they're all like,
Hmm.
oh, zone two training, fasted training, low
Yeah.
carbohydrate training. But that's all male data. And it does not work for women. It just increases the cortisol stress, it increases that sympathetic drive. And then we see that you have poor sleep, poor recovery, and people are like, what's going on? I don't understand this. It's because they're just not eating enough.
And I think so much of it is like this wider cultural narrative, and eating, well, it's hard work, you have to think about it, but it's the easy way, right? And I think you don't associate things that are enjoyable and like easy with fat loss,
Right.
right? Can you explain how taking in more carbs can help promote
Help with
fat
fat loss.
loss?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at, like I said, the hypothalamus in the brain, in women, we have two areas specific to the hypothalamus that registers endocrine function and appetite.
Hmm.
If we are low in carbohydrate, it downregulates one of those areas. So we have thyroid, downregulation of thyroid and appetite changes. And if we have appetite changes, then we also see a change in our luteinizing hormone. So if we are getting those perturbations by not having enough carbohydrate, then what happens is we put on body fat. And if you are going, wait a second, I'm training really hard and I have a little bit of calorie deficit to try to
Hmm.
lose this body fat, it's counterproductive because the
Yeah.
hypothalamus is like, wait, you've had this huge calorie expenditure and there's not enough coming in to support what I want to do. So I can't build muscle. Matter of fact, I'm going to lose muscle because it's very metabolically active. But, fat, I don't know when I'm going to need a huge amount of energy for big stress, so I'm going to store it. As soon as you start eating more, especially in or around your training, then the hypothalamus, those areas of kisspeptin aren't downturned. So your thyroid doesn't come down. You don't get a change in luteinizing hormone. You don't get the signal to store body fat. You have more robust signals for building lean mass and getting rid of visceral fat and getting rid of body fat. And it is very counter to how we all grew up, of calories in,
Yeah.
calories out, fat burning, calorie deficit. And so when we're having this whole narrative change and this sociocultural change and shift around carbohydrates,
Hmm.
it's really hard to take the health and fitness where people are like, oh, I don't want to have a lot of carbohydrate because it's not good for my health. Sure, and if you're sedentary, but that doesn't carry over to the athletic community. The athletic
Hmm.
community is a whole different population.
Right. And then if we also take that definition of athlete as being anyone who trains with intention, then it really even broadens who that applies to.
Right.
I I think I think we actually, and this gets into like this big cultural narrative thing even more, but I think we have such a strange relationship with food where we look at something. I don't know what I would take like a muffin or banana bread with me, or I'm actually kind of famous for taking potatoes on my
Nice.
rides now.
Yeah.
Um, but we sometimes look at that, and I hold it in my hand, and I can kind of like imagine like this is a symbol of me getting fat. I feel
That
there's such a strong connection, and maybe not just for me, but I think for most people, you look at a something with chocolate in it or something that is sweet or carb heavy, and you think, oh, that's good, just because that's what we've heard for so long.
And we've seen all these stupid magazine articles throughout our
Yeah.
entire life as women that says, if you eat a potato, then you have to run on a treadmill for
Yeah.
35 minutes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, no, yeah, no, no.
That's so
And
true. I remembered like seeing magazines and like there's a chocolate chip cookie and how many laps around the track you have to run or walk just to burn off. That's crazy. That's coming into my mind now. Whoa.
yeah, and they still happen.
Yeah.
In Christmas time, holiday time, there's always
Yeah.
those articles of if you eat this, this is how much exercise you have to do. And it just,
Yeah.
it, it's that whole idea around food is a reward or not a
Yes.
reward, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And we have a local hill here at people, it's 400 meters to climb, and one of the iconic things is to get an ice cream afterwards. I'm like, What? Why? It takes 20 minutes to get up there, but it's the
Yeah.
thing. You bribe your
Yeah.
child. Let's go up the mountain and then I'll get you an ice cream. Like, no, no food reward, just physical
Yeah.
activity for physical activity, for the views, to
Wow.
be around the ocean. But it's just so ingrained, right? And we see that all the time, which is why you look at a chocolate chip cookie and you're like, I don't know if I should eat that. But yes, you should.
Yeah.
It's great on
Yeah.
a long ride. 3 hours in, chocolate chip cookie, fantastic.
Cure all tired legs and bonks hitting
Yes.
the wall. Can you explain a little bit like I've heard you talk about sort of the evolutionary relationship and why this is the case for women, and I think aside from the physiology it helps us understand maybe sort of like this the stress response and why women and men are different in that regard in terms of the storing the fats and these sort of things.
Yeah, yeah. So, from that historical perspective, right, back in the hunter gatherer days, for the most part, because there are different tribes that had different roles, but for the most part, it was the male of the species who went out to fight the beast to get the calories. And
Hmm.
it was the woman of the species that would stay home with the kids or would be pregnant to reproduce for survival of the species. And when there's times of low calorie and low food availability, we see that men get leaner, fitter, faster
Yeah.
because of this evolutionary process where they have to go out and find the calories to bring home. But we see a different scope for women where women's menstrual cycles stop and they put on body fat. Because back in the hunter gatherer days, it wasn't cohesive to be able to reproduce and bring another mouth into the world if there wasn't enough food available.
Hmm.
And for the most part, when you're looking at the hierarchy, it was the male of the species that would get calories to be able to fight to bring back for the tribe,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
kids because it was survival of the species. So the woman would put on fat to be able to eat, not need as many calories to
Hmm.
survive, as
Hmm.
well as not have a menstrual cycle because they didn't want to bring any more kids into the world. So
Hmm.
from that evolutionary standpoint, that's why we're seeing a lot of what happens when we're trying these trendy diets with regards to differences between what happens with a woman's body versus what happens to a male's body.
Hmm. And can you speak a little bit to why you recommend so much that women track their menstrual cycle in that regard?
Yeah, it's a really good indication of endocrine health because
Mm.
when we are in modern society with all the stresses and we're also trying to train and or race well and change body composition, when we start to see a misstep in our menstrual cycle and we
Mhm.
start to see changes in either the bleed pattern or the length, then we know that there's a misstep right there with what we're doing from energy expenditure versus energy intake and stress. So we
Mhm.
have the opportunity to kind of take a pause and be like, okay, what's not working here? The other thing about the menstrual cycle and being able to track it is then it also gives you insight to your own personal experience of which
Mm,
days you can go really hard and which days you might not feel from a physiological perspective or even a
mhm,
psychological perspective being able to go as hard. So then you can tailor your training to match what your body's resilience to stress is. So finding your own patterns gives you
mhm,
so much insight to how you're responding to training, but also how you can develop your training plan around your own cycle.
mhm. Yeah, I think we've all experienced, and I've certainly heard from girlfriends, like, "Oh, I was feeling so bad this last week. Oh, and then I got my period, and I realized, oh, that's why."
Yep, exactly. Exactly. And if they were tracking, then they'd be like, oh, okay, well, I know the next few days I'm going to feel really crappy. So I'm not going to beat myself up about it because it happens every
Mhm,
month. And I think that's
mhm.
one of the empowering things when women start to understand the
Yeah,
days they don't feel so great, then they don't go through that whole checklist of what didn't I do right? Why didn't I
yeah.
recover well? And you're just like, oh, because it happens on these days every month.
Yeah, or even going into kind of like that self-judgment of, "Oh, I'm being a little bit of a bitch," or
Yeah.
whatever, like,
Yeah.
that it gives
Yes.
you some
Exactly.
answers.
Yes.
Um, and so that's kind of a little bit like that self-perception of the situation. What about in terms of like the actual training itself, in terms of how you feel and what you're gonna get when you're gonna get the most out of that training?
Yeah, so I always look at it as stress resilience and immune system, right?
Mhm,
So we can see that the body is really stress resilient in the low hormone phase. So follicular
mhm,
phase being day one of bleeding all the way up through ovulation. We see this because we can access carbohydrates, we recover better, we have more
mhm,
cognitive focus, more reactive time. Our immune system is one where it can fight off virus and bacteria really well.
mm,
And then after ovulation, there's this inherent shift where our body will take carbohydrate and put it into the endometrial lining. We
mm,
have more of a pro inflammatory response for our immune system because of the fact that we don't want the body to attack a fertilized egg. It's
hmm,
not a pathogen, it's a fertilized egg. And we see that we have less cognition and reaction and motivation because we're building tissue. Our body is under a lot of stress. So, if we're looking at how we're scoping our training, if we want to do the higher intensity work on the days that we're very stress resilient and feel great, then we see that's more in the low hormone phase.
mm,
If we're looking at how are we going to do more endurance, aerobic capacity, fat burning, those kinds of like lower intensity work, then we
mhm,
look at the times where our body is not maybe quite as stress resilient, but really good at giving us fatty acids to use. And so that's
mm,
after ovulation.
mm.
And again, like I said, it depends on your own cycle. But when we look from that top end physiological standpoint,
Yeah.
because training is stress, then we work with our physiology. And we want to work with the immune system. We want to work with our stress resilience.
Hmm. And is that also true for women who don't really experience too many symptoms, if that's the right word, in their menstrual cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're ovulating, you still have that change, right?
Mhm,
But we know
mhm,
that women have maybe 3 to 4 anovulatory cycles a year.
mhm,
So this is why you might not be symptomatic, but you will find different things, different patterns that might change.
mm,
Um, we see it when women are traveling a lot as well,
mm,
and we'll
mhm,
see like a lengthening or shortening of the cycle, then we know that they're not ovulating. But for the most part, we look at that immune system response and the inflammatory response, and
mhm.
knowing that your body does invoke an inflammatory response when you're training, and you don't want to
Yeah,
have that plus a systematic
right.
inflammation because it reduces adaptation. So again, it's like, okay, how am I going to work the best with my body and how these hormones are changing stress resilience, fuel utilization, immune system, inflammation?
I think a challenge is a lot of this conversation, and especially also when it comes to fueling and carbs, it seems like it's directed at performance. And so I think, again, a lot of these recreational athletes might be thinking, well, doesn't apply to me, but at the end of the day, it's just about enjoying the training more and getting, if you're already doing it, why not get more out of it?
Right. And we find that for the most part, women need more carbohydrate anyway, because like I said, we go through blood glucose faster, but our
Hmm.
brains also want carbohydrate. And when we are low in carbohydrate, we start to feel that lethargy and that flatness.
Hmm.
And I think people who are on the low carb bandwagon for the most part don't actually know how good they can feel.
Yeah.
And when you get into this constant state of this is my new normal,
Yeah.
then they'll fight that whole bringing carbs in because they don't know what it feels like to have that additional carbohydrate on board.
So you talk a lot about this low energy availability, but I guess a lot of women will say, "Oh, I'm fine." But what I'm hearing you say now is you might not even know that you're in that state.
Exactly. So many women, especially recreational athletes, walk around in that subclinical low energy availability state.
Wow.
And they are feeling a little bit flat all the time, not recovering as well as they can. um, any kind of training there, like I just can't hit higher intensities. I might not be getting as fit as my friends are, and I
Hmm.
don't understand why. Your mood is a little bit off kilter, where you might not have a filter most days. You might be snapping a little bit faster, and it's because you're walking around in this subclinical low energy state. And when people are like, "Yep, check, 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 check," yeah, that's me, that's me, then I'm like, okay, well, let's just try fueling in and around what you're doing, but
Yeah.
also looking at the new chronobiological research that's coming out. We're looking at let's eat when our body's under stress during the day when we're awake.
Hmm.
And if we're fueling for that, then we find that everything kind of flows a little bit better.
So hangry is real.
Hangry is real for sure. Look at any little kid. They start getting hangry, give them some food, and then all of a sudden they turn on a dime. Works for adults too.
Wow. Well, I'm glad my emotions feel a little bit like validated
Yeah,
now.
food is good.
So I've talked a little bit about like relatability and having people being able to say, yeah, that is me, and I do connect with that as something that's important for adopting these changes. And I thought one thing we could do is create these little avatars um, to have women say, yeah, that is me, and I relate to that. So I'll present to you two cycling athletes. We're gonna
Yeah,
bravely call them athletes, and maybe you
yes,
can give some suggestions about optimizing her goals.
sure.
Okay, so we have Carmen, who's in her late 20s, early 30s. She has a regular menstrual cycle, and she's starting to call herself an athlete, but she still works full time, and it really is more of a hobby. And she loves to do these after work rides. And right before it, she'll maybe eat a quick apple or banana and then do like a 2 hour loop. And then on the weekends, she goes for big long rides and takes a Cliff Bar that she eats usually around 2 hours in because she just came off of a big breakfast. Do you have any suggestions what Carmen can do to maximize her fun?
Yes. So if we're looking at what she's doing on the bike after work,
Hmm.
making sure that she has some kind of low carbohydrate electrolyte drink. And I'm saying low carbohydrate because
Hmm.
we want to look at around 3% for fluid absorption. So it's
Hmm.
not about a Gatorade that's 6%, but we're looking at like SOS or Scratch, even Noon, those that have electrolytes and a little bit of sugar, because that's going to
Hmm.
help with hydration. And if we stay hydrated, we feel better.
Hmm.
Having idea of what you're doing from a food standpoint during the day. So you might have breakfast and then you get to work and you're sitting at your desk and you might be sipping coffee
Yeah.
and you might have a break at like 1 o'clock. You're like, okay, I better have some lunch. Oh, I'm riding tonight. I might have a sandwich and some fruit, and then maybe I'll have some yogurt, and then at 4:30 I'll have my apple. So if we look at that kind of partition throughout the day, that is not enough to even get through the day, let alone add on a 2-hour ride.
Wow.
So we'd have like a real breakfast that has a good hit of protein, and then about 10:30 or so, we'd look at about another snack with a coffee if you're drinking coffee, And so we want around 10 to 15 grams of protein with that snack as well. So that could
Hmm.
be some, a half a serving of yogurt with some almonds and a little bit of honey. Could be a couple of boiled eggs. It could be some turkey roll up on some toast. Could it be avocado on toast? So you're having like a substantial snack. And then
Hmm.
when you get to lunch, it's about having palm-sized portion of protein with a couple of fistfuls worth of carbohydrate. Can be a grain, can be fruit, can be
Hmm.
veggies. So you're getting protein and carbohydrate,
Hmm.
making sure you're hydrating throughout the day. And then about 3:30, you're having another snack that's similar to the morning snack. And then right before she goes out, she's grabbing that Cliff Bar that she usually has on the weekend, and
Yeah.
she's splitting it in two, and she's
Okay.
eating half of it within the first 45 minutes and then the other half in the last half an hour before she gets off her bike. Then when she gets off her bike, before she showers, she's like thinking about dinner. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of protein
Hmm.
now. So that could be the other half of her yogurt, could be a small protein drink, takes a shower, and then has a real meal for dinner.
Wow. How important is that timing after you get
For
back from the ride?
For women, pretty important because we're
Yeah.
looking at refueling and shutting down that breakdown state. And
Hmm.
if we're a recreational rider and we're not thinking about it and we stay in this breakdown state, then we're actually reducing our ability to adapt and get fitter. And we're also signaling to lose lean mass. So that
Hmm.
it's really important with that timing. And also, when we shut down that breakdown state, signals to the hypothalamus that there's nutrition available and keeps us out of that low energy cascade that we know is so detrimental to women.
Yeah, I think that's probably somewhere where I have room for improvement as well because you need probably 30 minutes to cook a proper meal and you want to shower and all these things and then before you know it it's been an hour plus
Yeah.
since you got home from the ride. So that's a good takeaway for me too. You mentioned a bit about hydration and the importance of electrolytes. Can you break down what those electrolytes are and why?
Really, it's just sodium. So when
Mhm.
we're looking at what we're doing for drinking and fluid, it's not about calories and carbohydrate. So we're not talking about liquid calories.
Mhm.
So we're thinking about we have maximum two cages on our bike. So we have the ability to bring two drink bottles. We
Mhm.
want that fluid to work for us. And when we're are exercising, we have a lot of blood flow diversion away from the gut.
Mhm.
So our gut is getting very hot and it also has low blood flow, so it's hypoxic. So when we're drinking something, we want it to work with our intestines for maximum
Mhm.
fluid absorption. When we look at that, we need a little bit of carbohydrate in the form
Mhm.
of glucose and sucrose, and we
Mhm.
need a little bit of sodium because those three things are what really work all the fluid transport mechanisms in the small intestines to pull that fluid into the plasma space to keep us hydrated. If we start adding a lot of carbohydrate, then that sits in the gut and it actually pulls water from other spaces to dilute it before it can be
Mhm.
absorbed. If we have a lot of extra sodium, so more than 360 milligrams per 500 mil, then it causes a lot of water to come in to dilute it because then it ends up being too much sodium.
Mhm.
And then when you think about all the other things that people add to a drink bottle, like magnesium, calcium,
Yeah.
potassium, they're not really needed. Potassium is really important after exercise,
Mhm.
but during, it's not as important as sodium.
Mhm. And you mentioned something about like percentages of carb. Like, so for me, carb drinks are a really easy way to practice that eating contest and getting a larger amount of calories in. What is the like ratio and what's the limit of that?
So no more than 4 grams per 100 mil, which is a
Okay.
4% solution.
Okay. And if I understood correctly, then too much sodium by pulling like liquid away from other parts of the body could actually be a cause for cramping. Is that or?
Not so much cramping, because cramping is such a nuance. It's not necessarily sodium related or
Yeah.
hydration related, despite what people say. It's the one thing that sports scientists haven't really figured out.
Yeah.
But what we do see when you have that extra fluid that's pulled from other spaces into the gut, you get that gut distress and the bloating. And
Okay.
after a long ride, if you've had a lot of carbohydrate or a lot of sodium and that fluid that's been pulled in, you're very gaseous. And so, like, your partner doesn't necessarily want to be around you so much. So, all the things that we associate with long endurance efforts with nausea, bloating, distension, all of that comes
Yeah.
down to what are we putting in our system when we are actually exercising. Usually it's too high carbohydrate concentration. And then on hot days when people start throwing down electrolyte tablets.
Hmm. I've only had good experiences with salt tablets. Um, why why do we start cramping?
So there's a couple of different theories about it. One is small muscle spasm.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at fatigue and the smaller muscles are getting more tired than the bigger muscles and they spasm, that causes a cramp.
Hmm. Yeah.
We see a Golgi tendon response where you don't have enough stretch sensation anymore. So again, that is a little bit of a
Huh.
spasm.
Yeah.
Fascia that's too tight.
Hmm.
So as the muscle swells and the fascia is getting tighter and tighter, then you get a little bit of hypoxia and less blood flow and constriction. So that can cause a cramp. And then sometimes it's a magnesium and a calcium misstep where
Hmm.
we end up having a lot of calcium available in our bodies because we store a lot of it. But a
Hmm.
lot of us are low in magnesium, and you need both for proper muscle contraction. So you
Hmm.
have to have calcium that depolarizes, and you
Yeah.
have to have magnesium that matches the calcium in order for that muscle to actually contract properly.
So how does salt? Why do we think of salt as the fix for that?
I'm not sure. I think it really stems from people thinking dehydration is the cause of
Yeah.
cramping. And that if you have a lot of salt, then you're able to shift fluids around.
Hmm.
But there really has been no connection between sodium
Huh.
and cramping.
But sodium is essential to hydration.
Correct, because
Okay.
sodium is a transport mechanism for fluid. So we don't
Yeah.
have any plain water in the body. It's
Hmm.
always a
Yeah.
glucose and sodium solution. So that's what you want to bring in.
Okay. Thank you for. There's a lot of
Yeah,
confusion. It's amazing. All these things that are so normalized, and there's no clarity really around it.
that's because marketing is stronger than science.
Yes, true, true. But it sounds also like the science is a little bit kind of split or undecided on the
Yeah,
full picture. Yeah.
yes, yes, very true.
Okay, let's do one more avatar.
Okay.
This time, Jackie is in her late 40s. She doesn't have a super athletic background, and she's a mother of two. And she recently got into cycling because she thought it's a cool way to get active and she wants to try to burn fat. She does a couple of short rides per week and a few big adventures every month. She doesn't put anything in her bottle, and she usually rides on a pretty empty or like a middle empty stomach because, again, her goal is burning fat. How do we optimize Jackie's rides?
And we have a little bit of a sit down and we talk about how fasted training doesn't work for women and it's counterproductive because it actually
Mhm.
makes you hold on to body fat. And the body isn't an algorithm, so you can't jump straight to fat burning and be like, hey, we're just burning fat, because you actually
Mhm.
need carbohydrate to burn
Wow.
fat. Because
Wow.
systems need carbohydrate in order to get the mitochondria working to get into free fatty acid use. So if she's really looking to change her body composition, she
Mhm.
needs to fuel for what she's doing and hydrate and recover from it. So we can work on that. And similar to how the first avatar was looking at the patterns during the day, how we're
Yep.
eating, how long is the ride, and what is the intensity when she's going. So if it's super cruisy, we want to make sure that she has something before. If it's longer than an hour, she definitely needs something during.
Mhm.
Hydration across the board, recovering afterwards with that timing, especially the protein intake. And then for her big adventures, if she wants to really enjoy the big adventures, then you need to train with food during the actual training so that when you get to the big adventures, you
Hmm.
remember to eat and
Yeah.
start eating early, because what you do in the front half of the adventure directly affects the back half. And you don't want the day to finish with you being angry at yourself and people around you because you've had
Yeah.
a nightmare experience of not feeling good. So,
Mhm.
food is really helpful for that.
And women around this age, heading into premenopause, are likely, anyways, to feel that weight gain. And I know you advocate a lot for strength training, and there's tons of resources around that. But is there anything kind of like cycling specific for that age group?
Absolutely. Less volume, more intensity. So
Okay.
we have this whole idea of what we do in our 40s should be similar to what we did in our 30s. But when we are actually regularly cycling, or we're on oral contraceptive pill, or in our
Hmm.
younger reproductive years, then we can get away with a lot of volume and intensity. Our body adapts to that. But when we start getting into perimenopause, and that's the 5 or so years leading up to menopause,
Hmm.
and we're having changes in our hormones, then all the systems of our body are affected, especially body composition. So we need to find an external stress that is going to cause an adaptation the way that these hormones used to. So
Mm.
when we're looking at how are we mitigating body composition, we want some true high intensity sessions, some short, sharp stuff, so that the muscle adapts to being able to pull glucose in without insulin. We're getting some crosstalk between skeletal muscle and visceral fat, that we don't need the visceral fat. So if we're looking at our 40-year-old avatar who is cycling a couple of times during the week and maybe a long ride on the weekend for her, gearing up for a venture,
Hmm.
the sessions during the week should be planned interval sessions. So it could be
Hmm.
hill intervals, it could be sprint intervals, but it's something that's short, sharp, and hard. One, that's really going to improve her overall fitness, but two, it's going to create this crosstalk to really change body composition for what she wants: more lean mass, less body fat.
And I've heard you say kind of 30 seconds is like the threshold for that intensity.
If we're doing true sprint interval work, so then it's
Hmm.
at 30 seconds or less, full gas as hard as you can. And you might have 2 to 3 minutes full recovery in between. So I like to say, when you're doing your 30 seconds or less, you're looking at 150 to 210% of your functional threshold power. So,
Hmm.
it's really full gas.
Yeah.
And then that 2 to 4 minutes, you're looking at 50% of your functional threshold power. So you're those two opposite
Yeah.
extremes. And what a lot of women don't do well is the recovery part. So
Mhm.
if you work with a power meter, you can actually see that
Right.
polarization, and it's really important. If we're doing true high intensity interval training, so we're looking at VO2 work, or we're doing longer intervals,
Hmm.
then this would be 120%, 110% of your functional threshold power for the interval. And then the recovery is variable. If you're doing a hill climb, and then it's however long it takes you to get down the hill. If you're doing 2 minute efforts, then it could be 2 to 4 minutes recovery. So it's
Hmm.
not as full a recovery as when you're doing sprint stuff, but it is still that polarized where the recovery is at 50%, and then the interval is well above functional threshold power.
I think that can also be hard to allow yourself to recover, and really focus on quality over quantity. I think we have that feeling of satisfaction when we've been grinding in that middle zone for a long time, and I think that's a really hard switch to make.
It
So
is
thank you
hard.
for explaining that.
Yeah, it is hard. And I have people start off on Zwift
Hmm.
or indoor trainers so they can
Yeah.
actually see what it is and know what it feels like to recover, even if it's a beautiful day.
Yeah.
I'm like, for 3 weeks, we are doing this because I
Mm.
really want you to understand what that high end work is and what
Yeah.
that low end work is. And then your long rides, you can go outside, that's fine. But for our quality work, I want it in a very controlled environment, and no group rides when we're trying to learn our quality.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
group
that's a good
rides,
tip.
you end up in that whole middle zone, high end, middle, no true recovery. That's a different thing. That's fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good tip, especially when you're doing it on hills. That's something I fall into a lot is that my recovery ends up being still going uphill, and really concentrating on putting that quality first and making sure that recovery is doing what it's supposed to. So
yeah.
thank you for
You go
explaining that.
backwards on the hill. You do your 30 seconds up, and then you're like, I'm going backwards. I'm going so slow, I might fall over.
Well, it's hard because I want to keep my legs moving.
Mhm.
And when you're descending, obviously that's not as much, and it's really hard to find like a. Ideally, you'd have this flat road or like a slight decline.
Right.
But so that indoor trainer is a good solution if you have access to that.
Yes. Yes.
I sorry, I wanted to ask kind of one last question about the carbs, and we're talking about kind of carb drinks or sources of carbs. I've heard you say like as much as you can take in the real food for all those things.
Mhm.
When you don't have that as an option, or you're trying to like me get as additional carbs in from a drink, does that carb type in the drink matter? Like I've seen, dextrose, maltodextrin. I mean, these are all like Greek to me. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, we want to look at glucose and sucrose. So that could be dextrose and sucrose, cane
Mm,
sugar, grape sugar. We don't really want maltodextrin. It's
okay.
a glucose polymer, but it doesn't quite do the same thing as true glucose. So if you're
Hmm.
reading a drink bottle,
Yeah.
right, and we're like, okay, what's in here? What do I need? It should say glucose or dextrose,
Mm,
cane sugar, sucrose. The whole things like UCAN and Tailwind that have these glucose polymers, those
mm,
don't do much for you except give you GI distress. And we even look at
okay.
it from a research standpoint. They don't improve performance
Hmm.
any more than having like a Powerade and a banana.
Oh wow.
So, if you're looking at how am I going to get calories in, I often say, when you're doing long bike rides, Easter and Halloween are fantastic because you can go buy all your fuel the day after super,
Yeah.
super cheap because you can look at all those candies and be like, yeah, this is great fuel. It's glucose, it's sucrose. This hits the spot. On hot days, I have people who will use Mentos or chewy mints because they
Oh
get the
wow.
cooling of peppermint. So it
Hmm.
tells the brain, yeah, it's not so bad. And it's also giving you some good sugar.
Hmm.
So there's lots of different ways of getting it in rather than just having to rely on carbohydrates in your drink.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because again, I'm like, you have two bottles and you want them to be hydrating you, not necessarily
Yeah.
fueling.
And that's what I love about potatoes. I think has been a really big thing for me is that they can be salty and you're not just constantly getting in sweet
Exactly.
stuff. And I
Yeah.
noticed some of the sport drinks have potato starch and then other ones have like some kind of starch but they don't list. Like does that matter what kind of starch source it is or
So when they're looking at like tapioca or potato starch, it's just another way of saying maltodextrin.
okay.
Because maltodextrin originally comes from corn, but there are other
Hmm.
ways of creating it.
Yeah.
So yeah, if they're trying to be more transparent and not quite as like GMO oriented, then
Yeah.
they will use tapioca or potato.
Okay.
But yeah, it's still the same as like a modified maltodextrin.
But so, what is the difference then between eating a potato and having a maltodextrin starch?
So if you're eating a potato, you also
Hmm.
have different things in the potato that's going to
Okay.
rate limit how it's digested. So you have
Mm.
some fiber, you have some protein, you have the carbohydrate, and if it's cold, it's become more of a resistant starch. So
Yeah.
it's slower to titrate out into the system, which is good because you don't get this
Okay.
big wallop of carbohydrate. But if
Hmm.
you're drinking it and you're drinking a modified starch, it's this big wallop of carbohydrate all at once. And your
Yeah.
body's like, whoa, what do I do with that? So we'll either hang out in the intestines or dumps out all of a sudden. And then you're like, wait, I feel really not so great. And then you feel good and then you got
Okay.
to do it again. But by eating something, it keeps you more even in your energy.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's like across the board, a lot of people complaining about that gut problem when it comes to gels and all these different bars. So I definitely like this idea of potatoes and then Easter and, and
It's
Christmas
candy.
candies.
Yes.
That's great.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. A lot of tangible takeaways for myself and hopefully for our community today. You've got a lot of books that people can read. I know Roar is translated into German. Do you know if the other one will be translated into German anytime soon or for our European market?
Yes. So next level is being translated to Spanish, German, French, Russian.
Okay.
Um, Roar is also German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian.
Yeah.
And our second edition of Roar comes out January 6th. So it's been updated with new, well, because science evolves. So updated the science, put in more information about like heart rate variability or using a continuous glucose monitor, less of that performance oriented and more towards the general woman who is trying to be fit and active.
Our athlete, our brave
Yes,
athlete.
our
That's great.
normal
And
athlete.
I found your blog is super insightful, so people can check out your website, and you just have like endless resources out there. Is there anything else that you would like to mention where people can check you out?
So our website, you can sign up for the email,
Hmm.
and that's how you get the newsletter and the blog. Our membership as well, information on that is there. So we have Ask Me Anythings and resources in there. So it's
Hmm.
more community time and conversation. And then, of course, social media. We post things almost every day. It's
Hmm.
all science based and trying to be very practical on the information that we put out.
And you're offering courses as well, is that correct?
Yep. So we have online courses. We have the menopause one that is 5 weeks, where you learn everything in that whole menopause transition about
Wow.
what it is, um, menopause hormone therapy or not, how to train, how to eat, how to recover. We have the Women Are Not Small Men, and we have a new release where it is one that's more for professionals, really scientifically driven, and then we have one
Okay.
that's more for layperson. So
Mhm.
the general person who wants to know about themselves and how to train adequately and what to do and how to eat. And then we also have one that's coming out. It's a youth course designed
Oh,
for
great.
coaches and parents to understand, the 11 to 18-year old and all the things they're going through and how they should
Yeah.
train and what they should watch out for.
Wow, sounds really great. And I'm super grateful once again that you took the time with me today and answered all my questions and also told a little bit more about yourself. So thank you so much. And I can't wait to see what's coming next.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun. I told you we would go off and then we would have lots of fun today. So
Yes, of
sweet.
course. No, I believed it, but you're such a legend that it's like yeah.
Woo.
Okay. Thank you so much.